So hello everyone and New Year greetings from SEDS Online. My name is Shraddha Menon. Before we get started with today's session, I would just like to thank our sponsorship from IAS, which allows us to offer all these resources free of charge. So make sure and check out our website for more info on upcoming events and meetings and to see everything available for the community. Today's talk is by Dr. John Note, President of Sedimental Services and Visiting Research Fellow at the University of Adelaide, Australia. He completed his master's and PhD in sedimentary geology from London University, after which he has worked as an exploration manager and senior exploration geologist for Murphy Oil and Husky Energy and Shell International, wherein he led several exploration projects in the Middle East. With over 30 years of experience in the field of oil and gas, his other specializations include sedimentology, exploration geology, 3D reservoir modeling, and development geology. He's also extensively involved in teaching and coaching young professionals on diverse geological topics. In today's talk, he'll discuss the significance of macrofossils in aiding sedimentological studies. And with this introduction, I hand over the forum to you.
I'm going to start off by putting on this mask, just to warn everybody that today's talk is all about geology, but it's a lot easier to talk without it. So today we're going to be talking about using macrofossils in sedimentology. And I'm going to start off with a warning that there may be a slight bias towards dinosaurs in this talk because they are so suited to the topic at hand. So fossils provide a huge amount of information, and most of the commercially useful information has been drawn from microfossils and ichnology. So we've used microfossils for dating in places like the North Sea, and then we've used ichnology from core and FMI data to interpret depositional settings, possibly oxygen minima, and all the way through to things like sequence stratigraphy. However, macrofossils also have the ability to provide a lot of data to the sedimentologists. So by studying macrofossils and collecting and studying them from the field, they can help us to determine depositional settings, obviously, climate, water temperatures and salinity and turbulence, but also other aspects like deposition rates, paleocurrents, diagenesis, provenance, and other aspects such as geopedal structures, stratigraphy, plate tectonics, and isotopic data. So really, there's an almost endless amount of data that we can draw from fossils if we take the trouble to find them in the field and then to process them and use them. So today, I'm going to just take you through a selection of their potential contributions to sedimentology, but I'm really only scratching the surface here, as we'll see. So let's start off with a little refresher on how to fossil hunt, which sounds crazy, but there is actually a lot of useful information that you can get to help you with finding fossils in the field. So first of all, observe and record primarily. You don't need to hammer away at the rocks. Looking on the surface is usually the best places to find fossils anyway. Try and keep collecting to a minimum and avoid removing in situ fossils unless you actually need them. Only collect where material is plentiful and never collect from walls or buildings. So when you get to the field, have a look first, look around, observe and see what's going on with the geology, and you may well find more fossils than you would otherwise. There's a famous story of a gentleman who was working in the US who just noticed that all of the fossils seemed to occur in the dark gray shales. So every time they went to the field, everybody else was looking in the light gray shales, and he looked in the dark gray ones and found many more fossils. In terms of lithologies, fine grained mudstones are usually best, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Compare fresh and weathered surfaces. Not always weathered surfaces are best, but usually it's better to look on the weathered surface to find fossils. Think about the sunlight and the angle that the sun is shining onto outcrops, particularly if you're looking for fossils that may leave an impression in the rocks. Split sediments along bedding planes, and then you always need a little bit of luck. And I've put this picture in here from Duns Tew Quarry in Oxfordshire, this crinoid. I led a field trip to Oxfordshire a long time ago for Imperial College students, and two of the students went off for a kind of romantic interlude, and then when they came back, they were holding a big piece of crinoid, and they said, "Is this anything interesting?" And we went over there, and where they'd walked in amongst the trees, they'd found a previously unreported crinoid bed, which was just like a Lagerstätten. It was full of the most beautiful fossils. So you need some luck as well. And then finally, handling fossils and getting to know fossils can really help you. And this slide at the top here is pattern recognition, which you can see up here. And I've put some familiar objects, which I've kind of hidden away. And because you would be familiar with most of these objects, you might recognize them. So if I reveal them a little bit more, you can see that we actually have a cork there, a matchbox, and a golf ball. And by looking at these features and looking at different fossils, that can help you to get familiar with your mind, to get familiar with their kind of pictorial image in your mind, so that if you see them in the field at odd angles, you can still recognize them. So the best outcrops of fossil hunting, outcrops with low elevation rather than high cliffs, because otherwise too much sediment is being dropped down. Gentle slopes, high erosion rates are very good because obviously they weather away a lot of the sediment and leave the fossils. And then a fine grain size so that any eroded material can dry and be dispersed by wind. And then in terms of the fossils themselves, it's good if they're abundant within your sedimentary package, robust so that they don't just fall apart and be crushed in the rocks, and ideally cemented by siderite or in nodules or with thick shells to help to preserve them ready for you to find. So what rock type? Well, ideally, you want to be looking in mudstones. And in mudstones, you can see the fossils weather out easily. Fossils are generally common, so even if you do break one trying to get them out, it's not a disaster. That it's easy to get them out of the rocks, and the preservation is typically excellent. And the downside is that often that the vegetation tends to favor mudstone rocks, so it might be maybe less exposure there, and the fossils may be more delicate and easily broken. Limestone is also good for fossils, but beautiful preservation is common, but it can be difficult because limestone is often hard and massive, and you may be unable to chip out fossils. And you can use acid to try and help you, but nonetheless, it's definitely more difficult to get them out of the rocks. And then in sandstone, usually that's the worst preservation, where the shells are often weathered away due to the porosity of the rocks and groundwater moving through the rocks. And so you might end up with only just casts, which are difficult to identify. So now I'm going to move on to talk about some of the aspects that we can use macrofossils for from a sedimentological perspective. And we're going to start off just talking a little bit about deposition rates. And as we know, deposition rates are extremely variable, and these are influenced by sediment supply, distance from the source, water depth, biological processes, precipitation and weathering, topography, sequence stratigraphy, and erosion, resuspension, or dissolution. So the whole range of aspects here that can affect what's going on with your deposition rate. And when we look at this graph over here, you can see that there's a variety of deposition rates here, ranging from shoreline, which is relatively high, sitting up here, the gray circles, right the way down to the abyssal plain, where you would expect lower deposition rates. So the deposition rates in a terrestrial setting, which would probably be somewhere in the middle here, or somewhere here, are probably around 2 to 4 centimeters per year, something like that, or less in terms of millimeters. Now, there's also the Sadler effect to contend with, which is that deposition rates fall with increasing time span. So the longer time span you look at, the less is preserved due to the amount of hyartae or hyartises that occur within the stratigraphic record. So all of these rates, these depositional rates, will obviously affect the fossil concentration at any horizon. But you can imagine if you have a steady state where you have steady deposition rates, then if you do see higher fossil concentrations, that might suggest that your deposition rate was slowing. So if everything else is kept constant, fossils can act as a proxy for deposition rates. So the fossil abundance is also affected by many other factors, so that they also need to be negated before you can use the fossil density as a proxy. So the amount of upwelling and suitable climates that you have, so the fecundity of the environment, how rich the environment is in nutrients, will also affect how many animals you have and how many fossils you have. The energy extant in the environment of deposition will affect the amount of fossils, and the preservation potential, which is the strength of the fossil, how likely that animal is to be entombed, and finally, the deposition rate as well. And then predation and consumption and destruction of hard parts will also affect how many fossils you have. So when you look at the amount of fossils in the rock, your end members are usually completely unfossiliferous sedimentary rocks, which is usually due to anoxia. And then highly fossiliferous rocks, which would indicate some kind of mechanism that's helping to concentrate these animals. And in the middle, what you'll see is a small range of slower to faster deposition rates. And obviously, the faster the deposition rates, the more dilute your setting and the less fossils you're going to see. So if you do see a lot of fossils, usually it means that there's something else going on. So in terms of terrestrial versus marine deposits, in fluvial settings, deposition rates usually decrease away from the channel. So at the channel, you have the highest deposition rates, and then gradually as you move onto the overbanks, you get lower and lower deposition rates. And this is it's affected partly by migration rates, lateral migration, erosion of existing deposits, and the presence of tributaries. So if all being equal and with a relatively straight channel sitting in the middle, you do tend to decrease the deposition rate away from the channel. In estuarine settings, generally the deposition rate increases downstream, and this is correlated with vegetation density and suspended sediment load. And then in the marine realm, what we tend to see is that proximally, so at the shore face, upper shore face and beach, deltaic settings, we have the highest deposition rates, and then they gradually decrease as you go into more distal settings. And so beach and shallow marine settings have lots of fossils, but they may be broken because it's high energy. And deep marine settings have slow deposition rates, and you would expect higher fossil concentrations. And that can also be helped by compaction. So what we're going to do now is that I'm going to take you through the depositional environments from proximal to distal, and we're going to look at rich fossil accumulations from around the world that occur in each of these environments and look at why they are there. So we're going to try and tie rich fossil environments for each depositional setting. And this will show the best environments in which to find fossils and where you should be looking within these environments to have the best chance of finding them. So let's start off with this picture that I put together on macrofossil abundance. And what I've done is I've split it into vertebrates, invertebrates, and plants. And I've got a graph here showing their abundance here. So this is the vertical scale for abundance. And what we can see is that for fluvial settings, for the vertebrates, you don't preserve much material in braided rivers, but then as you go into meandering rivers, then you see a lot of dinosaur and land mammals that are preserved in these rocks. So the highest preservation rates are in fluvial settings. Then you don't see many vertebrates in the estuarine setting. And then as you go out into the marine realm, we have another increase here where we have a lot of fish fossils potentially preserved. For invertebrates, our peak is around tidal flats, estuarine settings, beach, and open marine settings here. So most of the invertebrates are going to be found in this part of the depositional environment, although we will also see small, thin-shelled gastropods and bivalves that occur on the floodplain. And then finally, for plants, almost any setting on land, terrestrial setting, is going to expect to see vegetation from uplands through the coastal plain. And obviously this will drop off into marine setting, but it only drops off a certain amount. We're still getting plant matter washed outboard and even down into very distal abyssal plain settings. So typically, as I said, fossils are dispersed throughout the sediment column, but they can be concentrated in various ways. And these ways include fecundity, so warm conditions, abundant food supply, winnowing, where you see winnowing of sediments and washing away of a lot of the fines and leaving more rich fossil deposits as a result. Low deposition rates, which can occur in terrestrial or marine settings, may be due to low accommodation space, isolated offshore highs and maximum flooding surfaces, or very distal environments where few sediments are getting out to. We also have episodic events which can concentrate fossils, such as storms and turbidites. And then finally, we have catastrophes, which are obviously the most exciting, which are things like floods, droughts, tar seeps, quicksands, sinkholes, volcanic eruptions, all of the really exciting stuff. So we're going to talk about some of those as well. And to preserve the fossils, we usually require fine-grained sediments. Cementation is fantastic, robust shells or bone, and not too much weathering. So let's start off in the fluvial, and we'll work our way all the way out to the abyssal plain. So in lower energy fluvial environments, where we see the most fossils are in fecund localities, so localities where there's lots of plant material, meandering channels, and there we might see fossils like this nice theropod tooth preserved. This is a nice fluvial setting here, and along this layer here, we're seeing a lot of material preserved. Backwaters in channels, we might see slow deposition rates, and that allows invertebrate material to accumulate. So for instance, this pond sitting in here, snails deposits, so you can get deposits rich in snails in the ponds, and also fish. We can also see channel lag deposits as well, where winnowing occurs. And this is actually a very common environment in fluvial settings for preserving vertebrate material. So this is a classic channel sitting along here. This is, you can see the lateral accretion surfaces sitting in here. The channel itself is about 10 meters in thickness. And then along this basal surface here, where this gray mudstone is overlain by the channel, we're seeing a lot of bone material. And here's a bone on that surface there, which has been winnowed with the finer grain material being washed away. Although it has to be said, not every large channel has a lag. And then in this channel here, we've got a reworking. So there's the base of the channel sitting along here. And then we have a layer here where there's been winnowing, and there's lots of bones here which are arrowed, which are along this same surface. These are all dinosaur bones from the Campanian of Alberta. When we turn to high energy fluvial environments, first of all, we have flood deposits. So those will be the crevasse splays. So these are obviously episodic, and these are usually restricted to a few square kilometers. We have large flood deposits themselves where you have a lot of winnowing, and there's an example here on the right where we have a flood surface here with a lot of intraformational clasts which have been sideratized, and then some very large bones that are preserved on the surface as well. And this bone here is a femur. It's over 1 meter in length, and it's preserved as part of this flood deposits. And then finally, we have storm surges, which I will come back to later on. So the work that I've been doing in Dinosaur Provincial Park over the last few years, I've got 87 data points from some of the richest fossil sites across the park. And what we can see in this top diagram here is that of these, most of them occur on point bars. So they're occurring on the point bar, lateral accretion surfaces, or inclined heterolithic stratification. We also have a lot of lag deposits as well. And then we have a really minor set of the more dramatic catastrophic events which contribute to some of these fossil sites as well. And when we look at what's actually concentrating the dinosaurs, what we find is that over half of them, they're concentrated because of really benign conditions. And then a lot of them are concentrated by winnowing. So they're the lag deposits, which are shown up there. And then a minor set of more extreme events, less consistent events. If we move to Aeolian lacustrine settings, then generally fossils are pretty rare in Aeolian settings. You know, not many animals live in the desert, and the animals that do are relatively small, but that you do find fossils within desert settings. And these are usually where you have deflation surfaces with winnowing. And then you may also see dune slumps, which have a low chance of fossils, but they have found dinosaurs which were actually, they believe, were preserved due to dune collapse. And this is an example of one here with an ornithoraptor, which was actually sitting on its nest. You can see some of the eggs in here, and it's believed by sedimentologists that these were preserved due to a dune slump, which just collapsed onto the top of the animal. And then you might see sandstorms as well. And then in terms of lacustrine settings, low deposition rates would show favor fossil preservation, and periodic droughts might also lead to rich fossil deposits. And we've got some drought settings here, a Greek lake, which is just covered with fish. You can imagine if sediment came through and covered these up, you could preserve a really extraordinary Lagerstätten fossil fish bed. And you do see these quite often in lacustrine settings, such as the Green River Formation. If we move out to estuaries, the richest fossil deposits are dominated by winnowed settings. And these are winnowed settings within tidal channels or along tidal sand ridges, and then onshore here along these beach bars as well. And you can see that this is all oysters here, which are actually, there's so many of them, they're forming a bank up to 1 meter in height. You also see them on tidal flats where storm surges may help to scour out and winnow out more material. And then in mangroves as well, you're seeing a lot of lags within the channels at the base of sand sheets and in the mudstone beds. So really, this is a very high energy winnowing environment to preserve any invertebrates. When we go out to the beach, as I said, the beach is really one of the most fecund settings. And you see a lot of winnowing here because of the waves washing across the beach. And that tends to concentrate material. And it's quite interesting if you go to somewhere like Barton or Bracklesham in the UK, where you have Eocene shark teeth weathering out, you can go and stand in the surf. And as you watch the surf wash in and out, you see the gravel being moved. And once the gravel stops, the shark teeth continue moving for just 1/10 of a second because they're that much lighter than the gravel. And so that's a great way to go fossil hunting, is literally to stand in the surf and then just cherry pick as these fossils are moving across the substrate. You can also see sequence boundaries with lag deposits in these settings, and revealment surfaces are very important as well. And so if this is an example here of a revealment surface. It's not the most beautiful photograph, I'm afraid there's pencil for scale, but what you can see in here is oysters and extraformational clasts which are preserved on this one surface. So this is often a great surface to look for things like shark's teeth, particularly if you go to somewhere like the Book Cliffs. You'll find that these revealment surfaces and also the sequence boundaries often preserve a great deal of shark tooth material. Shallow marine carbonates are also extremely fecund. So most of the deposits that you see, the reason why there are so many fossils in them, like this amazing Atlas Medusa from Morocco, is because that it's just perfect conditions. So you have big reefal buildups, lots of shells, invertebrates living around them, lots of fish as well. And you may even see low deposition rates as well, particularly in things like lagoonal settings. And these can also be redeposited downslope, which is more of an episodic condition to occur where you get these marine slumps. But overall, this is probably where you're going to find the most fossils of any of the settings that we're talking about. And then finally, in open marine, if you go to the open marine settings, obviously deposition rates typically are slower because less sediment is getting out into that part of the depositional setting. And what you'll see is that fossils are often concentrated at maximum flooding surfaces on isolated highs, and then episodically you get occasional storm deposits or turbidity flows. And I have an example here from Borneo, from the Miocene of Borneo, where we've got these little storm deposits here. And this is a mudstone environment, so this is distal mudstones. And you can see these thin little beds here, 1 to 2 centimeters in thickness. And these are extremely distal storm deposits. And what's happened is because these are more porous than the surrounding mudstones, they act as conduits for the groundwater, and the groundwater cemented them up with siderite and preserved hundreds of fossil crabs and other fauna. And one outcrop that I looked at, which is maybe half the size of a soccer pitch, that contained 26 different species of crab and another 75 species of invertebrate fossils and a few vertebrates as well. So incredible diversity here, and it's all preserved in these thin beds thanks to the sideritization. So this is just a summary. I've been through all these already, so I won't bother going through them again, but you can see this is our 5 concentrating mechanisms that decide and determine the abundance of the fossils. And just to give you an example from Fluvial, we can see that coastal overbanks are very fecund and lots of food for the animals to eat. Channel lags, you'll see a lot of winnowing there, so you get fossils in there. Low deposition rates, you'll see overbanks with low accommodation space, which are concentrating dinosaur fossils. And then episodic events like crevasse blaze and floods, and catastrophic events, which we'll come to in a moment, like storm surges. And we can do this for each of these depositional settings, and you can see there's lots of ways to concentrate fossils. So some of the examples of these fossil beds by environment, I've done a study which is based on the North American examples, which we'll come to in a moment, but you can see from around the world, I've just selected some. So fluvial overbanks, we've got the Wealden of the UK, Aeolian deposits, the Clarence Formation of South Africa, lacustrine, Green River in Wyoming, and then estuarine somewhere like the London Clay in the UK. Shallow marine settings, Brook Cliffs is obviously a fantastic example. Beach and shore-face carbonates, probably one of the most famous is the Solnhofen limestone from Germany, which has yielded Archaeopteryx amongst many other fossils. Open marine settings, we're going to talk a little bit about Ordovician shales going on in the talk. And then finally, there's some other wacky examples like ashfall beds and glacial settings as well. So when you look at the fossil environments for these North American data, I looked at 156 extraordinary fossil sites across the country and classified them by environment and what was going on with those deposits as well. And we'll see another diagram in a moment. And what this graph shows is that fluvial settings host the most extraordinary fossil sites. So that's around close to 60 out of our 150 were fluvial in character. And I think this is the reason for this is it's easier to find large vertebrates like dinosaurs or mammoths. They're very popular, so you get more funding to look for them. And also fluvial settings are more liable to catastrophic events because you don't get droughts and fire at sea typically. So it's more likely that you're going to have these extreme events on shore. And then I also did some work on published bone bed data from around the world, just to show that the most common types of deposits with a lot of bone beds, a lot of bone material in them are floods and also hydraulic settings. So this is floods and this is hydraulics. So waters and winnowing of the beds to create these bone beds. So these are the most likely settings, and then drought as well. So all 3 of these that create the bone beds are all terrestrial. And so after these terrestrial settings, what we find is after fluvial is that the most common are shallow marine clastic and shallow marine carbonate deposits in terms of the most extraordinary fossil sites. So what agencies are actually concentrating this material? This is a pie chart here showing the different settings. So what we can see is that in the terrestrial settings, it's really quite a nice balance, partly due to really nice conditions, which is in green. but then some winnowing events, some slow deposition, some episodic events, and some catastrophic events. So it's quite a nice balance here. We can see Aeolian and Fluvial are very similar, and estuarine is quite similar as well, although there's more winnowing in this high energy estuarine setting. When you come out into shallow marine, you can see that in terms of carbonates, it's usually just because they're very productive. That's why they have so many fossils. And then in clastic settings, the dominance is for slow deposition rates, and that continues out into the open marine as well. And this is something that I want to apply from around the world, and also to see whether there's any difference as you go through stratigraphically from different time periods. So now, having looked at the different depositional settings, another very important aspect that we need to look at is tauponomy. And tauponomy is the study of how organisms decay and become fossilized or preserved in the paleontological record. And it comprises events that occur between the death of the organism and its burial, and then diagenesis, so events that occur after the burial as well. And you can't draw conclusions about the lives of fossilized animals without knowing about how they became fossilized. And so certain processes may favor resistant fossils or sort certain fossil types, or be affected by the behavior during life. So if animals are infaunal, so if they live within the sediment, there's more chance they'll be fossilized. And basically, these all lead to taphonomic biases, and that you need to be aware of these if you're collecting fossils in the field, because this will affect how fossils are preserved and why you have particular fossils in particular settings. So some of the biases are the attributes of the organism. So whether it's got a robust shell or whether it's very fragile, for example, will affect whether that animal is typically preserved. The characteristics of the habitat will obviously affect whether you have animals that like wet conditions or dry conditions. You can mix fossils from different places. So you get a lochthonous deposits where material is washed in, and most deposits are washed at least to a limited extent. Not many animals are fossilized in live position. So that is something you always have to be aware of. The impact of deposition rates obviously has a strong effect on what fossils you're going to see and how many of them there are. And then you can also get gaps in time versus event beds. So you can get whole sections of time where you don't have any deposition, or you can have event beds where you get a massive amount of deposition in one go. So you might deposit 4 meters of sediment in a day compared to having no deposition for 100,000 years. And then there's also human bias as well. So human bias, if you're working on fossil clams, if you go to the field, I bet you're going to find a lot of fossil clams compared to some of the other fossils, because that's your bias. So that's something that you have to guard against as well. So what I'm going to do is to show you a few examples of tauponomy, where you could not have used sedimentological data alone to delineate the depositional settings. So you actually need to look at the fossils to be able to sort out what's going on depositionally. So I should just mention before we start that other agents that affect the tauponomy, and these are things like the slopes and currents. So if you have different shaped bones, then they behave in different ways. So obviously a skull or a vertebra is relatively round, spheroidal, and they tend to be easier to mobilize, particularly rolling downhill or being washed along in a current. And less easy fossils to transport are things like disc and blade-like fossils, which are less mobile. And this can lead to biased assemblages and could affect the biostratigraphy as well. So if you're only preserving one shape of organism or one shape of bone, then that could actually affect what is preserved in the fossil record. So here is our first example of a depositional setting. So this is the Snyder Quarry, which is an upper Triassic bone bed in New Mexico, the Petrified Forest Formation. And what you find in there is that you find terrestrial and aquatic vertebrates. And depositionally, usually it's just a mudstone. So it's actually quite difficult to see what's going on in these floodplain settings. So how can you find out a little bit more about what's going on? And that's by looking at the tauponomy. And what you see, and when you look at the sediments in detail, is that the rip-up clasts come from the floodplain. There's bone and wood, which is aligned. And this is a diagram here showing, mapping out some of the bones that were found in the quarry. And you can see that particularly the wood, which is this dotted lines here, are very clearly aligned. And a lot of the bone material is aligned with these as well. There's high density of bone, which suggests local transport and sorting, and all the skeletal material is associated. So it was buried rapidly. There's no indication of weathering indicators. And putting all of this data together suggests that this is probably some kind of wildfire deposit. And that's supported by the fact that there's a great deal of charcoalified wood in this setting as well. Now we're going to turn to the Howe Quarry in Wyoming, and this was discovered by collected and mapped by Roland T. Bird for Barnum Brown. And what he found was that there were up to 25 sauropods. And since then, there's been more work done by a Swiss team, which is in the area up here further to the northwest. And what we find is that there is a huge amount of bone material in this quarry. And what's kind of nice is that a lot of the tail and neck material is also aligned. So you can see here, this is our key for our sauropod. And we've got the red is the backbone and the neck. Blue is the legs, and green is the shoulder blades and the pelvis. And you can see that there's a huge amount of material, and yellow is the ribs. So up to 25 long-necked dinosaurs were discovered in the original study. And then when you look at the actual photographs of what was going on here, what they did was that they made a decision to try and expose the bones in situ before they collected them. And this is how Roland T. Bird was able to map them out in that diagram on the previous page. And you can see that there was just a herd of dinosaurs there. And the interpretation of this work by looking at all of the dinosaur fossils is that we had a group of sauropods rushing into a watering hole, and they became mired, or possibly some of the carcasses were washed in during floods. So next we're going to turn to monospecific bone beds of Dinosaur Provincial Park in Alberta. And there's at least 25 bone beds that are scattered through the stratigraphy of Dinosaur Provincial Park. And this is a photograph here, and there's a bone bed actually sitting in along this horizon here. And you can actually see some of the bones sitting in along that contact, just sitting in over there. So mostly these are monodominant, so you've got almost all one type of dinosaur, Centrosaurus in this case. And some of these deposits, these bone beds, feature up to 1,500 individuals. And they know this because they counted the horn cores on their heads. So they have these orbital horn cores, which sit just above their brow region here. And each dinosaur only has 2. So for some of these, they're collecting up to 3,000 of these horn cores. Most of these bone beds are either mudstone hosted or occur in channels. And so it's a little bit difficult to know exactly what's going on. So why would they occur in mudstone beds and occur in paleo channels? So what they did was that the paleontologists went and did a study of the Tauponomy. And what we see is that the carcasses are disarticulated. Yeah. Most trabecular bones, so that's the bone with the Herbertian canals in it, the hollow bone like you'd see with your bones have been removed. There's no weathering. And this suggests that you had rotting carcasses deposited in water-saturated conditions, and that allowed the bone to rot through time. We see unimodal orientation data, so they are hydraulically sorted and they are aligned in some way. We see fragmented bones with teeth marks and green stick fractures, which suggests scavenging and trampling after death. And then there's a presence of a range of sizes of organism, which suggests a mass kill event. So they're not all adults or babies. There's whole herds of these animals. And then there's a common pattern in all of the 25 bone beds, which suggests that this is a repeatable event. Now, when you look at the sedimentology, you've basically got 10 centimeters of mudstone, which I'm showing down here on the lower right. So it's very hard to interpret from that what's going on. So without this taphonomic data from the dinosaurs, it'd be very hard to recognize what was happening. But what we think was happening is that there's a very low coastal gradient. And so no high ground to provide protection for the herds of ceratopsians. So if you get a seasonal storm, which induces a storm surge, which would be up to 5 or 6 meters in height, facilitated by the high temperatures in the Cretaceous, which increase the size of the storms, then this would lead to big storm surges washing in up to 100 kilometers inland and just basically drowning these poor animals. And that if the water was actually standing there for a prolonged period, then that would be enough to drown each of the organisms. And then once the water recedes, it allows the skeletons to settle out across the floodplain. So I've just got one example here from one of these bone beds. You can see there's lots of bone here, 5 or 6 ribs, a femur sitting in here as well. There's a vertebra sitting in here, the scapula there as well. And then if we look at this, the zoom in of that photo I showed you before, you can see the bone bed with the bones along this surface here. So we believe that this is all basically a catastrophic event. Another example of where taphonomy can really help you to interpret what's going on is the Wadi al-Hitan. And this is an extraordinary deposit and a World Heritage Site, middle to late Eocene in age, with basically open marine sandstone beds. So these are open marine sandstones sitting in here, and they host an extensive vertebrate fauna, including sirenians, turtles, sea snakes, sharks, and even a pelican, which was found last year. But it's most famous for 4 species of fossil whale, and over 1,500 fossil whales have been found. And you can see one of the examples here. This is a Basilosaurus, beautifully preserved and gradually eroding out in the Egyptian desert. And these have been interpreted. You need some explanation for why there are these whale deposits and why there are 1,500 specimens here. And it's believed that this particular environment back in the Eocene allowed a lot of algal blooms to occur. And so there's no direct evidence of the algae. Depositionally, you can't tell they were there, but by using the fossils, you can tell that this is probably what happened. So now we're going to turn to paleocurrents, and currents of all kinds can wash fossils together. So this might be flowing water, it could be flood waters, or it could be winds. And this can result in the alignment of linear fossils such as belemnites, wood fragments, and scaphopods. So long linear animals can be washed together and give you an idea of the directionality of the currents. They can also align delicate fronds from crinoids, graptolites, and plants, so that there's lots of ways of getting evidence for paleocurrents. And in the absence of sedimentary structures, this may be the only evidence that you have for current directions within the depositional setting. So this is a southern US Paleozoic case study that was done in Alabama and Tennessee. And what they did, the sediment was far too clayey for any crossbeds or ripples. So the only way to get paleocurrent directions was by looking at fossil specimens. And they looked at 13,000 different specimens to try and get the orientations. And then they related this to paleoslope orientation. And they actually looked at graptolites, brachiopods, cricionarids, ostracods, gastropods, and tentaculites. So they had a range of fossils that they did the study on. And this is just to show you graptolite orientations in the Athens shale. So we've got 150 feet of section here, have 50 meters of section, and you can see a very consistent orientation of these graptolites throughout the Athens shale. So this suggests that the methodology is robust. And then it's interesting when you compare the orientation data for the different types of fossils. So what we find is that the gastropods align with the current, with their long axis parallel to the current. But most of these fossils, like the tentaculites and the brachiopods as well, they align perpendicular to the current. So you have to be pretty careful about when you're looking at these fossils that, yes, your fossils may be aligned, but you need to make sure that you have an alignment, whether you know it's perpendicular or parallel to paleoflow. Now, there are other things that you have to be careful of as well. And looking at the Ordovician Wufeng Formation in China, we see aligned graptolites in black shales, and they show clear evidence of current activity. This is just an example here, actually from the Scandinavia, to show aligned graptolites. But you can see here, when you look at the data that from the different outcrops, that the alignment is actually, it varies through time. So there's a change in paleocurrents through time. And what you find when you look at these sediments in detail is that in A here, you have high currents, enough to overcome the resistance or the friction of the seabed, and you end up with nicely aligned graptolites. So there are graptolites in other orientations, but most of the graptolites are aligned parallel to paleoflow. If the currents are lower than the resistance rate, so the graptolites just stick on the seabed, then the graptolites are in disarray. But what's also interesting is that if the current strength is much higher than the resistance level, the animals get washed away, and then they'll be transported and deposited in disarray as well. So you need a kind of Goldilocks situation where the currents are just right here. So that just shows, once again, that you have to be pretty careful when you're looking at these fossils to understand what's going on with your current regime. There are also Aeolian deposits which show evidence of paleo wind directions, and obviously there are not that many fossils in Aeolian settings typically, so it is a bit more challenging, but vegetation patterns that you see in the dunes can also help you. So what you tend to see is that most of the vegetation will occur in the interdune deposits, or in the small areas where water might concentrate along the dunes themselves. And generally what you'll see is that the plants, or certainly the bodies themselves, the whole plants themselves, will be aligned parallel to the dune ridges. But it is challenging, but I thought it's worth mentioning that even in Aeolian settings, you should be looking out for this as well. And then in terms of floods and hurricanes, floods tend to definitely concentrate material, and we've got some flood deposits here. This is from Moose Mountain in Alberta. So here in 2013, we had a huge flood, which I have presented on at BSRG. And you can see here that all of the trees are aligned perpendicular to the channel orientation. So you wouldn't expect to see the trees, you might expect to see them parallel to the channels, but they're actually at right angles. And then this is a Cretaceous example, also from Alberta, where we can see a lot of fossil plants here. These are all branches that I've marked with these little red dashes here, just to show that the branches are aligned. But if you use the same methodology as for this, that would suggest that the Paleocurrent was in one of these two orientations, running across the outcrop rather than parallel to the branches. When you look at hurricanes, hurricanes can also create aligned material, and this is from Key Biscayne in Florida after Hurricane Katrina. I was lucky enough to go and look at the mangroves there, and what you can see is the mangrove plants have been knocked over here, and the hurricane path, which they're able to track, came through in this direction, so from top of the photo to the bottom, and it's aligned the trees parallel to that hurricane path. So let's just think of another, before we finish, a few other sedimentological uses for macrofossils. And one of the ways that you can use them is for leaf margin analysis. And what you find is that in warm tropical areas, higher percentage of leaves with smooth edges. So this would be your tropical leaf here. And then in more temperate environments, you get more toothed leaf margins like this. And the reason is due to transpiration. The toothed margin will increase a leaf surface area, allowing it to transpire more and photosynthesize more. So what you should do is you should collect fossil plants, fossil leaves, and apparently you need at least 27 to 30 specimens to have a statistically significant data set. And then you can see here that that will allow you to start getting an idea of how warm your climate was back when these sediments were deposited. And this is from Borneo, where you can see that this is clearly a tropical, smooth margined leaf. And then here we've got, it's not the best specimen, but this comes from within about 500 meters of my house. So it's important. And these sycamore leaves, they have a very toothed outline. And so I was able to put together a nice depositional setting model based on this toothed outline and based on the fact that we had more temperate conditions. This is a temperate environment here, paleo reconstruction of the Paleocene from Livingston subdivision here in the north of Calgary. So we collected a lot of fossils and a lot of leaves here, both smooth and toothed margins, but that was able to help us to sort out the climate. Another way of using fossils is that here in North Wales, we've got the Llanfwrdd quarries for dolerite and black mudstones. And these were deposited in marine conditions in a back arc setting. And what you see is that you get infrequent ash falls which coated the seabed. And these preserve snapshots of the seabed. So you can see here in the depositional settings, we have rhyolitic tuffs here, more tuffs up here, and so lots of volcanic eruptions that were occurring in this back arc basin that we see here back in the Ordovician. So when you look at the fossils themselves, the fossils are beautifully preserved here. They're actually preserved as bumps that you see in the ashfall beds, and the trilobites can be up to 20 centimeters in length. And the whole depositional setting here, everything is telling you stories about what's happening with the ash falls and what's happening with the primary seabed as well. Another way that you can use fossils is for geopetal structures, so way up structures. So sometimes it's very difficult to tell which way up your beds are. And many invertebrates have hollow tests or shells, and this allows for them to be partially infilled by sediments and later infilled by cement. So I've got a beautiful example here from the Cretaceous of the UK, from the chalk. This is Micrasto, which is a very famous echinoderm used for stratigraphic purposes. But what we can see here is that it looks like sediment has entered through the anus of the animal, and the coarser sediment has filled up the basal portion of the hollow test. And then later on, silica-rich pore waters will come in and fill the rest of the test and crystallized out. So what we have is an animal that has flint at the basal portion and basically glass for the upper portion here. So obviously this sea urchin is the right way up, with the crystallization happening later. So you can use this geopetal information in almost any environments, but it's particularly relevant in limestones. So the very last thing we're going to do before we finish is to look at assemblages of macrofossils and how they can be used to differentiate settings. And we're back in the dinosaur world, and I've got two outcrops here for you that were full of fossils. So we have a pond here, a fossil pond, which is actually preserved in this as ironstone because it's full of plants, and the plants have acted as a nucleus for cement. And what we see here is that we get a lot of fish fossils here, garfish scales, pieces of fish skull, fish coprolites, and then minor amounts of dinosaur material. And then when you look at this crevasse splay deposit, what we see is that we have lots of teeth. So lots of hadrosaur teeth, theropod teeth, and crocodile teeth and scutes. So a really different assemblage depending on what environment you have. And that's obviously because in a pond, you're going to get a lot of fish living in there as opposed to having many vertebrates, terrestrial vertebrates washed in. So this is what it looks like in outcrop. So here's the old man formation. So this is Campanian. And what we're seeing here is that there's this pond here, which is running across, which gets to about probably 50 centimeters in thickness, but it's full of fossils. So when you look at this data and put it together, we can see from our pie charts here that a flood deposit, crevasse splay, still has a lot of garfish in it, but a lot of crocodile as well in yellow here, a lot of hadrosaur teeth and some theropod teeth, meat eater teeth. And then in comparison, the pond is dominated by fish with relatively small amounts of dinosaur material and very little crocodile material. So if we put our succession back together here, what we see is the flood deposits over here with some crocodiles. That would be your flood, your crevasse splay. And then over here, we have a pond which is basically full of fish with the odd dinosaur roaming around the edge of it. So by using the different assemblages, you're able to put together different depositional settings. And a final word on siderite and also other cements, they are the fossil helpers because they help to preserve fossils and data that we would never otherwise see. Generally, they form very early after the deposition, and they often preserve fossils in 3 dimensions. And I've just got some examples here, some bird footprints, which are cemented to an ironstone layer, a siderite layer. You can see here the beautiful 3-toed footprints. Then we have this dinosaur here who has his actual organs preserved as sideritic casts and siderite cemented tissue remains. And that's the intestine sitting in there. And also the brain is even preserved in this animal from Italy. And then finally, we have these 3-dimensional fish fossils sitting in here as well from the Santana formation. So just to conclude, we've only scratched the tip of the iceberg today. The macrofossils can provide a huge amount of data to assist the sedimentologists, and are obviously, they're very important in determining the depositional setting. But as well as that, they provide data on deposition rates, taphonomy, paleocurrents, geopedal structures, diagenesis and sedimentation, provenance, which I didn't get a chance to talk today, and also so much more. So I would say to every sedimentologist, you really need to unlock your inner paleontologist as well. So I'm going to finish there by saying thank you very much and just showing you this beautiful Centrosaurus head shield from a junior dinosaur. So this is probably a baby here, and this is his head shield sitting here, preserved as a flood lag in one of the deposits. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for the talk. And I would just like to remind everyone the chat is now open for questions. You would like to type your questions in the chat. Just
before we start, I'd just like to apologize. My wife is busy working downstairs. So if you do hear talking in the background, it's unavoidable because she has a job as well.
Sure. All right, so we have a lot of compliments coming up. So Jacko writes, fantastic talk, and thank you so much for educating us. Chris also gives the same thing. This is so great. Do you lead field courses? The question is,
yes,
do you lead field courses?
So I have about 15 field courses that I run out of Alberta and a couple of international ones as well. But what I've been working on the last couple of years, and this leads on from great work by people like John Howell, is leading virtual field trips as well. So I've got lots of, every time I go to the outcrop now, I try and put together some extra videos while I'm there. So even though I'm logging sections, I'll take a few videos and then we have that information available as well. So I can give virtual field trips as well as real ones, but obviously everybody likes a real field trip. And it's funny, I've been running teaching courses for my company for the last 4 years, and 90% of them are field trips because that's what everybody wants.
Sure. Okay, so we have another question from Stephen from UK. So he thanks you for the fabulously informative talk, and this is a multi-part question. So the first question is, what is the best fossil you've ever found? And then the second is, what is the most useful fossil that you've ever found? And the third is, what is the fossil that is highest on your bucket list?
Oh,
it's a 3-part question.
Very good question. So one of the best fossils I ever found was I found a whole dinosaur tail that was exposed in the field, and everything, all of the vertebrae, all of the ossified tendons around it. And I was so excited. And I went back to the Royal Tyrrell Museum and I said, I found this dinosaur tail. And they said, oh, where was it? And I told them, and they said, oh yeah, we know about that one already. And apparently it had been excavated, but they already had a better tail for that dinosaur, so they didn't need that one. So they just left it out in the field. So I was very excited to find it, but it wasn't very helpful. The most useful fossil is also probably personal bias, but those bird footprints that I showed you, I found them while I was doing my PhD, and it was such an exciting thing to find those footprints. So in terms of my personal well-being and keeping me interested in the project, I always had those bird footprints to fall back on. So I think they're probably my favorite fossil that I've ever found. And in terms of bucket list, that's a good question. So I think everybody would love to find an Archaeopteryx, but what I'd love to find is that in these terrestrial sediments that I'm working on, there's occasionally you get these muddy estuarine deposits, and there are marine reptiles that are swimming in from the coast and swimming up the estuary. It's much like you see the whales swimming into the Thames in the UK. And I would love to find a plesiosaur skull in Dinosaur Provincial Park. And that's something that's never been found. There are bones, but they've never actually found a skull. So a plesiosaur skull in Dinosaur Park would be perfect.
All right. Okay, so we have another compliment too by Monica. She thanks you very much for the interesting talk. And we have another question from David Stanbrook. Amazing compilation of concepts into a single talk. This would make an amazing guide for keen amateur fossil hunters and specialists too. Any plans to plan a short publication or book for the general public?
Yeah, so when I started off this, basically I've been doing work as a paleontologist for the last 3 months, and I've had the chance to walk out hundreds of kilometers of section and look at what's going on with the fossils that were preserved in them. And so it was one of those exciting things. I had all this data, and then I started pulling it together at the end, and all of these concepts are popping out of the woodwork. And so I am going to put together a paper in the first half of this year that covers this, just talking about how fossils behave, where we can expect to find the most abundant fossils, and looking at all the statistics as well from around the world. So yes, definitely planning a paper. In terms of a book for the general public, it would be fun, but there's quite a lot of fossil books out there, and I actually have a lot of them myself. I've got a weakness for buying the books on fossils and dinosaurs, but it would be great to have something for the public. So I've given a couple of talks, outreach talks for schools and things like that, where I've explained how to find fossils. And so maybe this is something that I could build upon with the publication. So thanks, Stan, for the idea, and good to see you here as well.
Well, okay. So if there are more questions, please do type in the chat box. Meanwhile, I do have a question. So we talked about the Tauponomy and how we can use that to infer the depositional environment. Can this happen the other way around too? Like, can this create erroneous results? What if some amount of diagenesis or alteration give us erroneous results on the depositional environment? Is that possible?
Yeah. Oh, definitely. Yeah. So it's something you have to be pretty careful about. I mean, I see an interaction between paleontology and sedimentology. And the trouble is, you talk to paleontologists, and a lot of them are fantastic on bones and morphology and those aspects, but don't necessarily consider the sedimentology as much. And then for us, we tend to consider the as sedimentologists, we tend to consider the sedimentology, and the fossils kind of come along with that as well. And we maybe don't focus on them as much as we should. So it's really important that you tie the two together. And I've seen quite a lot of cases where something I didn't talk about that much, but where you have reworking, especially of heavily cemented fossils. So, for example, in glacial sediments in the UK, you have lots of shark teeth, and those shark teeth, you look at that and you think, wow, look at all the shark's teeth in here, but they're actually reworked from the Eocene. So in some of the older publications, you see people describing that in glacial times, there are a lot of sharks around the UK, but actually all of those shark teeth are reworked from the London clay. So it is quite easy to rework well-cemented material or nice hard fossils into younger deposits. So you do have to be careful. So you're quite right. Tauponomy only goes so far.
Okay. All right, so we have another comment from Pradeep, who thanks you and SEDS team for enlightening both amateurs and professionals with your worldwide experience.
Oh, thank you.
And okay, okay, so there is a question by Jacko. In which ways can soft bodies of animals be preserved?
So I didn't really talk about Lagerstätten today and soft-bodied animals because that's almost a separate field, but obviously there's a lot of work that's gone on with Lagerstätten, and there's a lot of work on the internet as well. But generally speaking, what I found with soft-bodied fossils, to preserve them, obviously you need very fine-grained sediments and you need really, really steady deposition. So you don't want to have any cyclicity in there if you can avoid it. So deep marine is obviously a good place for them, but you do find a lot of Lagerstätten in lakes as well. So in those cases, it's getting that sediment in there pretty quickly to kind of like cover them up, the fossils up, before they have the chance to be predated upon or also to rot. And what you see in things like the Solnhofen limestone, and that's probably one of the most famous Lagerstätten, which is where Archaeopteryx came from, is that there was an anoxic seafloor. So the anoxic seafloor also stopped animals coming in and actually eating the soft-bodied material. So anoxic conditions, very fine-grained sedimentation, steady state sediments without any event beds as well, is what you're looking for ideally.
Okay. Okay, so we have another question from Noor, Hungary. Thank you for your very nice presentation. Are there factors that can change quantitatively beside the current or slope direction during the geological time? So this is with respect to the index fossils.
Yeah. So yes, there are lots of other factors as well. So well, reworking is I think this question really goes back to allochthonous versus autochthonous. So are your fossils in situ or have they been transported in any way? And as I was saying about the reworking, you can also see biases that are created in the stratigraphic column as well as from one environment to another laterally. So you have to be a bit careful about that as well. So you can actually see where you might not see index fossils because of their low preservation potential, even though they should be there in the stratigraphic column. So they'll only appear later when the depositional settings change. So yeah, good question. That's very true that there are other factors which do influence where your index fossils occur.
Okay. So we have another question from Nina Bremen. Thank you for the talk. You mentioned provenance is one of the areas where macrofossils can be of use, but not having time to expand on it during this talk. Could you just give a quick summary or an example?
Yes, so this is funny because it's from my master's, but from my master's we went to northern Spain, and one day we went out and we basically mapped out an area with a lot of alluvial fans, and we collected different material from those different fans. And what we were able to do was to use the fossils that they contain, so the transported blocks of fossils, to work out where the provenance of the different areas was coming from. So we had limestones which looked quite ostensibly similar. Some of the limestones had one set of fossils in them and some had another. And that allowed us to infer two different provenance directions, or two different provenances for the sediments that we were seeing. So the fossils were extraordinarily useful as opposed to using rock types in assessing where these alluvial fans had actually originated from.
Okay, pretty good example. And then we have another question from Patrick, Bavaria, Germany. Thank you for the great talk. And what details of sedimental structure and fossil content are tsunami deposits recognizable? Yeah,
okay, so there's quite a lot of published material on tsunami deposits, and I could actually send you some because it's something that I was interested in as well, and in finding out how you recognize them. So first of all, they're pretty rare. You often see very large boulders in them. So it's not so much the fossil content, but you see these boulders which are transported across. So what you'll see is perhaps a limestone pavement at the coast, and then you'll see big boulders on there, and they're being transported during the tsunamis. And the other thing that you see is that if you go inland from there, you might get terrestrial deposits where you have concentrated layers of microfossils. So I purposefully avoided microfossils today. because we're really talking more about macrofossils in this talk, and there's lots of work that's been done on microfossils. But really what you want to look for in your depositional settings is to find those layers where you have a very high concentration of marine fossils in a terrestrial environment. And the storm surge that I mentioned earlier when I was talking about the bone beds, we do occasionally see marine forams in those beds as well. So there's another little indicator there that we've definitely got water coming in from the sea to the land. So it's you kind of like your anachronous positioning of marine fauna in a terrestrial setting is probably the best way from a fossil point of view.
Yeah, no, well.
Okay. Let me just see if we have any more questions, and I don't see any more questions. So maybe we can wrap this up. And before wrapping up, I would just like to remind everyone to join us next Wednesday, where our main watcher will discuss on the insulation pace, sea level, and sediment flux during the early Pleistocene in Southeast Asia. And during the meantime, please also join us at one or more of our global SEDS online coffee breaks. So please do visit our website for more details. And with that, so there's one more compliment by Amy. She thanks you for your brilliant talk. With that, I thank you for the talk, and I thank all the audience for having joined us for the talk today.